welcome to Bookish After Dark. Today what I want to talk about is Ernest Hemingway and gender fluidity. I just finished watching the Ken Burns film about Ernest Hemingway, which if you're a Hemingway fan, you probably liked, and if you're not a Hemingway fan, you probably completely ignored. But one of the issues that came up in that movie that Ken Burns made about Hemingway has to do with Hemingway and his relationship to, or his interest in, gender fluidity, and then his relationship with his transgender son. So I want to talk about those things here briefly because I think it's really interesting. I don't think there's any doubt that Hemingway in some way had some interest in androgyny. It comes up far too often in his fiction. It comes up far too often in his real life. I did a whole video a year or so back as a part of a series I did on Ernest Hemingway. It was about, I think the title was Ernest Hemingway, What's with the Hair? I'll leave a link to that video up above and maybe in the end cards at the end. But Hemingway seemed to have an obsession of sorts with women who had short hair. At one point, he and his first wife essentially had the same haircut, and they grew their hair out to look the same. That was Hadley. His second wife, Pauline Pfeiffer, also got a short haircut, and then their hair looked the same. His fourth wife, Mary Welsh, at one point dyed her short hair platinum blonde, and Hemingway actually dyed his hair to match. There are numerous occasions in his books where we see women with short hair. Lady Brett Ashley, based on the real-life friend of Hemingway, Lady Duff Twisden, had short hair, and she dressed oftentimes in mannish clothes of the 1920s. We can see that in Maria from For Whom the Bell Tolls has short hair. And then, most probably explicitly, we see that in the posthumously published novel, The Garden of Eden, which I'll get to later, but in which the main character's wife cuts her hair short intentionally so that she can look like a boy. Anyway, there's clearly some indication that at the very least what Hemingway liked in women was short hair, women who had hair that was short like a boy's. There's also, the old story that Hemingway's mom dressed him like a little girl when he was a child. She actually dressed him, according to the Ken Burns video, to twin with his older sister, to whom he was very close his entire life. And sometimes they dress as boys and sometimes they dress as girls. But I do think there's a real interest here that Hemingway had, in some ways, with this idea of gender fluidity, of people having characteristics of both genders, or people, exploring the idea of having characteristics of most genders. And as I pointed out, that is explored explicitly, and as a matter of fact, that it really in some ways is the theme of the novel The Garden of Eden. Now, The Garden of Eden was something Hemingway worked on near the end of his life. I think he had written something like 200,000 words of that novel, but he never could get it together. At the end of Hemingway's life, he was struggling to write. He was struggling with his mental health and his memory and his emotions. But he wrote obsessively about that novel, and the implication has been that because he didn't get it finished, that's why it wasn't published. But Hemingway himself believed that the novel might be too sexually adventuresome to actually be published in the United States, and he was well aware that it might change people's ideas about him and how he felt and how he thought, and kind of change his image. By the way, while I'm on that topic, we get this idea that Hemingway was constantly creating this kind of mythos around himself as a tough guy, as a manly man, and there's certainly truth in that. He certainly told some tall tales about his life, particularly as he got older and his mental health declined. He told a lot of stories about his life that weren't true, but were intended to make him look more manly. But it's also important to point out, at the same time that's true, we have Hemingway writing this novel, which is the very least about being married to a woman who today we would label as a transgender woman, or as someone who is trans in some way. And he constantly put these characters in his novels, these women with short hair, these women who looked boyish, And the reason you and I can talk about that, and Hemingway's apparent real preference for that, is because he wrote about it in his own books. And so, he kind of, in some ways, I think, was actually challenging his own ideas. But when he married his fourth wife, Mary Welsh, it seems that these kind of issues, this kind of interest that he had in gender fluidity really reached its peak. And so at one point, he actually wrote in his diary about his wife Mary's desire to be a boy.
She has always wanted to be a boy and thinks as a boy without ever losing any femininity. If you should become confused on this, you should retire. She loves me to be her girls, which I love to be, not being absolutely stupid. In return, she makes me awards at night. We do every sort of thing which pleases her and which pleases me. Mary has never had one lesbian impulse, but has always wanted to be a boy.
Now, in the interest of full disclosure, Mary also wrote about these incidents and about their sex life. And her implication was that Hemingway wanted her to behave this way. That it wasn't her, that it was Hemingway wanted to behave this way. And that's all well and good. I'll also point out that he wrote about this exact thing in the Garden of Eden.
Please love me, David, the way I am. Please understand and love me. He had shut his eyes, and he could feel the long, light weight of her on him, and her breasts pressing against him, and her lips on his. He lay there and felt something, and then her hand holding him and searching lower, and he helped with his hands, and then lay back in the dark and did not think at all, and only felt the weight and the strangeness inside, and she said, "Now you can't tell who is who, can you?" "No." "You're changing," she said. "Oh, you are. Yes, you are, and you're my girl, Catherine. Will you change and be my girl and let me take you?" "You're Catherine." "No, I'm Peter. You're my wonderful Catherine. You're my beautiful, lovely Catherine. You were so good to change. Oh, thank you, Catherine, so much. Please understand. Please know and understand. I'm going to make love to you forever." At the end, they were both dead and empty, but it was not over. They lay side by side in the dark with their legs touching, and her head was on his arm. The moon had risen, and there was a little more light in the room. She ran her hand exploringly down over his belly without looking and said, "You don't think I'm wicked?" "Of course not. But how long have you thought about that?"
So, all these things that we get from the Garden of Eden, I think, do make it clear that Hemingway had an interest in the concept of gender fluidity, of men and women switching or sharing characteristics of one another, and that line between men and women wasn't as firmly divided as people of the time period thought, and as many people thought today. But in addition to that, it's important to remember that Hemingway's youngest son, Gregory, was in fact a trans person. He was in fact, at the end of his life, a trans woman, and that Hemingway knew about this for almost all of Gregory's life. Around the age of time that Gregory was, I think, somewhere around 11 or 12, Hemingway actually caught him dressing in his mother's clothes. According to Gregory Hemingway's son, John, in an article which I'll leave a link to down below, after catching his son Gregory cross-dressing, I guess, for lack of a better term, or dressing in drag or wearing his mother's clothes, Hemingway really didn't say anything to him about it, but when Gregory came out to swim in the pool, and they were alone, Hemingway said, in effect, "You and I are members of a strange tribe," indicating that on some level, perhaps, Hemingway understood what Gregory was going through. Now, it's also important to note that Gregory Hemingway and Ernest Hemingway had a very fraught, difficult relationship, and that Ernest Hemingway in some way believed that, at least indirectly, his son's wearing of women's clothing, his son's gender fluidity, his son's struggle with the fact that he was a trans person in a world that didn't accept trans people. Ernest Hemingway believed that contributed to his mother's death. As a matter of fact, he said as much to Gregory, which really created a rift between them. The issue then, and the question is, and this is one of those things that isn't confirmed, is, was Hemingway mad at Gregory? Was Hemingway blaming Gregory for his mother's death, Pauline Pfeiffer's death, because he was trans? Or was he just blaming him for his mother's death because he had actually been arrested? Gregory Hemingway was arrested in the ladies' room, I believe, of a department store, wearing women's clothing. And was Hemingway blaming the arrest and the shock that caused to his mother, or was Hemingway actually blaming Gregory Hemingway's struggle with the fact that he was a trans person and he wore women's clothing? Was he blaming that for his mother's death? I will say that, Gregory Hemingway wrote his father a really scathing letter, which you've seen the Ken Burns video or movie. You've seen that letter, and that Hemingway's response, also that you can see in the Ken Burns movie, was somewhat hey, okay, fine, I don't think I'm as bad as you say I am, but come and see me anytime you want to, even though they never really did patch up their relationship. But Gregory Hemingway, Ernest Hemingway's, John Hemingway, Gregory Hemingway's son, Ernest Hemingway's grandson, believed that Hemingway accepted on some levels his son Gregory's, the fact that his son Gregory was a trans person. And it wasn't that made him mad. And he points out that, in a letter following a visit that Gregory Hemingway had made that came before Ernest Hemingway accused him of being the reason for his mother, Pauline Pfeiffer's death, that what Gregory Hemingway had done during that visit that made Ernest Hemingway mad was that he had insulted Mary Hemingway and stolen some of her clothes. That he wasn't angry with Gregory Hemingway for being trans. He was angry with Gregory Hemingway for being disrespectful and for stealing Mary's clothes. This is one of those things I don't think we're going to know. And certainly, if you are of the opinion that Ernest Hemingway was macho He-Man and he couldn't tolerate the idea of having a trans son, then you will discount any evidence, even from Hemingway's grandson and the son of Gregory Hemingway, Ernest Hemingway's trans child. You'll discount that and say that Hemingway, ostracized Gregory Hemingway because he was trans, and I can't tell you were wrong. If you're more willing, perhaps, to listen to other things about Ernest Hemingway, you may, as his grandson John believe that Hemingway in some way sympathized with Gregory Hemingway and was unwilling to cut him off and was unwilling to cut him out of his life because of the trans thing, because Gregory Hemingway was a trans person, but was instead angry with him about other things, like getting arrested and stealing clothes and being disrespectful. Anyway, I found this kind of an interesting topic. Hope you did too. Look forward to your comments in the comment section below. As always, thank you for watching.